Indie or AAA?
AAA.
Free to play or pay to play?
Pay to play.
iOS or Android?
iOS.
You're listening to ironSource Level Up with guest host Mishka Katkov.
Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to Level Up, the podcast for people who love making, growing, and of course, playing mobile games. I'm Melissa Zalouf, and I'm joined on the show today by Mishka Katkov, who's head of studio at Rovio, and who's been guest hosting Level Up with us for the past few episodes. I'm also joined by Christophe Carvenius, head of insights at Tactile Games. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today on the show, we're going to be discussing puzzle games. So what makes people play them, how they've evolved, and where they're going in 2019. Now, Mishka, you recently wrote an article on your amazing blog, Deconstructor of Fun, on how to climb to the top of the puzzle category in 2019. So my first question is, Christophe, have you read the article?
Oh no, I have not. Shame on me. We're working on it though.
It's a big one. It's actually a really long one, so don't worry about it.
Fine, you have plenty of time. So maybe, Christophe, just to kick us off, give us a little bit of background on how did you get into the gaming industry in the first place? Why puzzle games? Tell us your story.
Yes, so I've done a lot of varied things. I used to joke that I went from performance marketing to performance art. So when I started my career, I was working with AdWords and performance marketing and such, then made a little foray into culture, after which I got started on the puzzle games, into King actually, in Stockholm.
So games don't count as culture?
I didn't say that.
That's right.
No, but I worked for King, started there when Bubble Witch Saga was taking off on Facebook. I was at that time mainly doing data analysis on skill games. But this was the time when Candy Crush really started to happen. So around 2012, 2013. And that was a super interesting experience, of course. And also introducing a big new audience to puzzle games generally. After that, I've been working a couple of years more. I moved down to Malmö and worked on Petrescu Saga, did a little stint as a global mentoring role for data scientists, and then worked with technology at King. And then 2 years ago now, Tactile Games recruited me to Copenhagen.
Chris, can you talk more about Tactile? It's not the most familiar name for the games industry people. Of course, very known company in the Nordics, but...
Yeah, that's true. It's a little bit of a hidden gem. So we're an up-and-coming company, currently are around 70, I think the headcount is. The company has been around for some time, trying various genres like runners, and now lately puzzle games. And it was with the puzzle games genre that growth started to happen for this studio.
So if we kind of jump in and talk about a little bit more about puzzle games, especially designing, the monetization, and what I found the most interesting right now is marketability. Can you talk a little bit about the design process and how you kick off a puzzle game? Because it is a very saturated market and it seems like everything has been tried and it's kind of like now matching together new things.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, design process here is tightly coupled to build, measure, learn cycle from lean startup. So it's these iterative cycles that we keep doing. Some of the kind of core values for us are that we want results to be validated. And that's how we kind of learn all the time to build better puzzle games.
So do you mean that you have a very strict sort of a prototyping process where you try to get really quickly to a playable that you can measure somehow with external markets?
Exactly.
So can I ask in a more detail, like how long does it take for your project? Let's say you have a team, a small team, prototype team. I would assume a team of between 3 to 5. Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
So how many weeks do you give that team before they have a first playable that they can start testing in real market?
That's a couple of months at least, I would say. Of course, we have like the technological framework to speed up that process, but getting somewhere with a product that's viable, then you need to polish it up a bit at least.
Of course. Okay, so let's talk about the iteration of the genre itself. So, everybody knows it's the biggest category in mobile games, but it's also probably the most saturated with pretty much everybody competing from Zynga to King to Rovio to Playrix. So there's a lot of big players, a lot of small players, and a big pie to be shared. But there is some innovation coming in. And how do you add that innovation? How do you look at the market? And what kind of twist are you trying to bring? I mean, I played Lily's Garden. Is that your latest game?
Yes, exactly. It's going for global launch on Thursday.
Okay, so I was ahead of my time.
Yeah, exactly. Congratulations. So I think a really important aspect is to think of innovation as, well, in Hegelian fashion, like a recombinant ID, something that brings in something oftentimes recognizable into the puzzle genre. I think the opportunity for doing that is getting greater and greater over time, also as the audience matures. So So if you look at the audience, first Candy Crush framework was really, really simple in terms of you had the saga progression. I think you had maybe 2 in-app purchases. We talked a lot about the end game dialogue. And that was actually added after hard launch. And my point being here is that it's very, very locked down. It didn't open up that many opportunities beyond playing. So you were very focused on progressing. But over time, as we see the audience maturing, they also expect different things. They like more deeper design, something that gives them some sort of meaningful goals to strive for.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the sort of evolution of the puzzle genre, as you mentioned. And as we can see from the data, it's been pretty clear that the installs have been quite stable for a few years now, but the revenue has been growing. And, as you mentioned, Candy Crush Saga has been growing their revenues for maybe 7 years straight, which is just insane, while the downloads have been going down. So what factors do you think play into this?
That's a big one. I think one factor that I talk a lot to my colleagues about is that to some degree, I think the whole free-to-play market is quite immature. You get exploitative tactics and designs based on loss aversion and things like that in the industry. Mainly, I think, because the scale is so big. So you get very quick returns from these tactics, but they're not necessarily a good way to build long-term customer relationships. So I think that has saturated the market a lot because you get these very quick returns on sometimes fairly poorly executed products. And then you have the big companies double down on offering the existing payer base more and more enticing features.
Do you think something that plays into that is just better understanding of you have a data scientist background, so do you think the understanding of how players behave is also playing into that? Because it helps to optimize the levels, of course.
That's my analysis of it. And I think there is plenty of opportunity to build long-term relationships, but we haven't really started to see that happen yet as much.
Yes. So one thing that is on everybody's top of mind, of course, in games is marketability and the CPIs, basically. But the marketability is basically how to decrease the CPI and how to decrease the risk early as possible. And we've seen games like Matchington Mansion just fire through the charts since last year. And part of it, maybe even a quite big part of it, can be attributed to the marketability. I mean, they've been very creative with their creatives and kind of, trying everything and anything and seen pretty tremendous growth. So do you guys have a Tactile? Do you have some kind of process where you look at the marketability and see if the game is worth launching? Is that the first prototype where you see kind of how the core gameplay performs and then you decide to go forward? Or do you do any other kind of early marketing testing and things like that just to see how you can scale it?
Yeah, exactly. Then you might get into these local minimums of optimization where you're very quick to draw conclusions on, hey, this works because we see this KPI going up, but that's not necessarily a long-term impact of it. So things that are gradual, which is, for instance, helping players move along from being extrinsically motivated to intrinsically motivated in doing the activity. That's like a long-term endeavor, which doesn't lend itself as easily to being measured.
Can I ask one thing regarding the marketability? And as you said, you're just about to push Lily's Garden into global launch. So one thing that is happening is during soft launches, of course, you work on optimization of the game, you add more and more content to it and so forth, which is working with the retention and monetization KPIs. But the other part is the marketability, and especially how do you ramp up the UA? And my question is like, how much do you invest into user acquisition? What test markets are you using? And are you doing anything different than the others? Because just as a caveat, one thing that we've been seeing now is a lot of games are soft launching in US already, where they can start measuring how they can scale once they go global.
Yeah, I mean, we try a lot of things, as I mentioned, with this build, measure, learn cycle. Of course, soft launch gives us some indication of it. What we see generally, it's the same old truths, brand awareness, stuff like that, impacts marketability. Genre is a big one. The saturation on clickers and switchers. That's very clear that there are some genres being more competitive than others.
So you're saying your creatives are different though with Matchington Mansion? Because they're pretty wild.
I think we currently have mostly a traditional approach where we use non-English speaking markets, for instance. for us at least, it is more of a matter of being able to compare, so benchmarking. So since we do 2 or 3 launches per year, we do have that benchmark in those markets. So it's fairly simple to pick up on signals where we see that, hey, this game is going to do roughly the same as another game, or, well, this one definitely has promise. Then how much of that is creative optimization versus targeting versus the actual characteristics of the game is still hard to disentangle.
I actually want to jump in here for a second because you're reminding me of something that we're seeing on our end. Mishka, maybe you're seeing this too, that creative is becoming an increasingly big part of the soft launch process. You're not just testing for your monetization and retention metrics, but you're also looking to see what are your best performing creative so that when you hit global launch, you're kind of already going out there with your strongest formats. Are you doing anything like that at Tactile? Is creative part of your soft launch process, or is it something that kind of comes in later on?
Yeah, it is definitely part of it. And the benefit of doing it is you get fairly reliable numbers, but we're definitely preparing or gearing up for hard launch. Personally, I think those creatives that work the best is where you have a consistent messaging. So you have a whole funnel that is consistent in its messaging.
Christophe, your role as head of insights, how does that lock into either kind of marketability or design? Where are you kind of looped in the process?
Consider it still like a smallish company.
You do it all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Or at least I poke my head in occasionally. But to me, as insights person, I think it's very easy to make incorrect inferences. So that's one of the areas where I try to support the teams the most, from very simple confidence intervals to more advanced modeling and stuff like that.
And how does that loop into the psychology, the motivation behind kind of playing puzzle games?
A lot, I would say. That's an area where we probably haven't, or the industry probably hasn't experimented enough. Because if you set some sort of potential goal for the players already in the creative, I think that's a very promising avenue. So when I talk about psychology, I tend to be mostly grounded in self-determination theory with 3 dimensions of need satisfaction, where you have the need for competence, feeling competent, need for autonomy, and the need for relatedness, that people matter.
One hope.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for puzzle games, in terms of need satisfaction, puzzle games are great at supporting the competence dimension. You feel that you are progressing, you're getting better, you're improving your skills, you're competing with others to get benchmarks, etc., etc. But if you look at those psychological needs, that's one area. And what we may be seeing with Matchington and also Homescape in their creatives, they are maybe gearing towards more of that autonomy supportive features. So, building stuff and customizing. So if we want to tie it into psychology, then I think this whole consistent messaging, where you're very clear of what group are you trying to target with this, or what kind of personality are you trying to target with ads, that can most likely go a long way. But again, it's a lot of testing and research to hone in on that.
So then I have to ask, is there one psychological driver that's more powerful than another? Is competency kind of more or less powerful than autonomy or relatedness?
I think it wholly depends. Generally, it's often harder to see the effects of relatedness. I mean, autonomy, that's now if we just talk about games at least. MMOs, clear autonomy supportive frameworks, some relatedness. But if anything, it's the relatedness dimension that I feel, at least so far, hasn't been the most important one.
So do we want to jump on the kind of an interesting question, which is in-app purchases versus ads? And then traditionally, of course, puzzle games are very in-app purchase driven. So what's the position of ads in your games?
So previously we've had interstitials and rewarded video. I mean, just from the scale of things, interstitials are less and less relevant every day, as you all probably know. But for rewarded videos, that's an interesting aspect. I mean, they lend themselves perfectly for any kind of in-app purchase design, don't they? And I think you see a lot of games using that as, watch an ad and get 100 coins, etc., etc. But to me, the more interesting aspect of rewarded video is when you actually try to use that in your design to introduce premium features to a wider audience. So a trial, if you will. So introducing something to a wider audience. I mean, you can seed stuff, but that gets very on rails kind of, where you click here to start this booster or whatnot. Whereas if you let players discover something something by spending 30 seconds to watch an ad and then unlocking a particular feature. I think that has a lot of potential.
So one thing that happens usually with ads, there are actually a few things. So, I mean, internally, when you're working with ads and you're primarily an in-app purchase studio or you rely on in-app purchases, that's not the first thing that we tend to think about. But then, it's usually from strategic perspective. The local VP of ads will come in and say like, listen, guys, you have to do it, and you get some pressure. And the first thing that the game team says back is like, well, we don't want it to lower retention. Now, is that something that is not true at all? Or is there any case in that? What do you think?
I think very little case for rewarded videos. Obviously, you're going to get the share of the audience interested in whatever is being presented. But if your product is strong enough, then they're likely to come back. And that share is, the click-through rates on creative, so it's not very high. But I've seen some effects when we introduced interstitials, and that does make sense because you can hypothesize that there is some sort of attrition effect if you push it too far.
Yeah. But basically, rewarded ads, no effect on retention, to your knowledge.
Again, if your design is holistic enough that it is more of a natural feature trialing.
So basically where people can initiate themselves the ads and they're not initiated automatically on your face of 30-second video.
Yeah, exactly. And then they get to try a feature and then they can see, oh, this was useful or this wasn't useful. Then you're probably not going to see an effect. But if people find use in the designs that you make, then that can actually have a positive impact.
So till date, it's been about 5 to 10% of revenue that developers are making through ads in puzzle games. Is that the case with you guys, or are you optimizing your ad strategy so that you're generating more?
Little higher share, I think. I don't have the numbers, but it's above 10% at least, if I remember correctly.
Do you think that's likely to grow? I have an argument with a colleague here at ironSource where my claim is eventually ads are going to eat IAPs because people become less and less ready to pay for things and more ready to pay with attention. So you'll see more rewarded ads or more value exchange ads because people will just be more ready to pay with their eyeballs than they will with their credit card. And of course, my colleague disagrees with me vehemently and he says absolutely not. Not to mention, of course, that the amount of revenue you can generate from even a small percentage of users converting on IAP has traditionally dwarfed the amount of money that you can make with ads. Although this is obviously different when you kind of go into the hyper casual genre, but not getting into that. You guys project ad monetization taking a growing share of overall revenue, or do you expect to kind of stay the same?
I would probably say it will stay the same in the scheme of things currently. But I think if you do it right, then you can drive both. We have seen some examples of that because of this feature introduction. That's the mechanism I'm thinking. So you are right, people are less prone to pay straight off the bat, but if properly introduced to a particular feature that is useful and makes sense for them in their playing experience, then those ads can actually lead to conversions as well.
Interesting. Do you want to jump on to the next section and talk about something known as the evolution of puzzle games?
Small topic.
Yeah, small topic.
Yeah.
You've been doing puzzle games since they were on Facebook, right?
Yeah.
So that's about 10 years. Am I correct?
Yeah, rough, give or take a few.
Yeah, exactly. Because I remember making games for Facebook and that was about 10 years ago. So what were the biggest pivotal moment during this time span when puzzle games came onto iOS in form of Candy Crush?
Yeah.
So what has happened since? What were, in your opinion, sort of like the pivotal moments?
Yeah, so a lot of it is actually platform driven. So first Facebook, then mobile games that allowed for this kind of explosion or rapid growth where everyone had some sort of device where they could play. But to me, it's a little bit more interesting to talk about it from a developer point of view, where I remember in the early days, we were almost exclusively looking at KPIs. So various metrics on monetization, of course, retention, even some poor metrics like DAU over MAU.
I remember that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we were generally trying to find out, what makes sense here. And what we got to a high degree was, understanding the direction of the wind, where the wind was blowing, but maybe not the climate as a whole, So then, developers turned to more of these behaviorist theories, Kahneman's seminal work on thinking fast and slow and all the psychological biases and that. And it was touted almost as guidelines for designing engaging games. But then we understood, hey, the wind is blowing that direction because people are doing this in this exact moment. So we were better at understanding particular decision points or actions that people take. But the long-term perspective isn't really applicable for behavior theories generally, at least from what I've found. And then the industry started to turn to more of these psychology of motivational frameworks like self-determination theory. And you had Scott Rigby's book coming out, Glued to Games, that was discussing a lot of the long-term impact of need satisfaction. So I kind of see that as the journey, where it was very mechanical initially, building out with some more theoretical frameworks. And now at the point that, games are being studied, on par with, let's say, exercise or some other activity that we as humans do.
Can I throw my sort of pivotal moments just looking at the puzzle category from the side?
Yeah.
So I would kind of divide it up to 5 points. So I would start with 2012 with social and saga mechanics. So basically Candy Crush launching in 2012, and you had the close tie-in with Facebook, and that was like really important that you have the saga map and you can see where your friends are going and you can send friend invites, and it was kind of like a mobile game but still very tied to the Facebook platform. And then a couple of years later, a year and a half later, we kind of entered this sort of a resources and builders, and Big Fish Games was making this sort of a game where when you play, you collect resources and you build something up, and that was what we thought would be the next thing. And then in 2014 came the companions and upgrades with the games like Best Fiends, where you're playing the puzzle levels and you were investing into these sort of like an RPG characters, and it was a little bit like RPG, but it wasn't quite like that. And then we get into that 2015 and go into 2016, and kind of even now with your latest game, The Lily's Garden, is like the collection and decoration that turned into narrative and decoration games. So those were kind of like my moments when I look at the feature sets and I look at the evolution of the games. It kind of feels like they were going towards one aspect, and like with the resources and builders, it really reminded me of those hidden object games like we had back in Facebook, where you complete hidden object levels and you get some resources and now you can build some stuff. But now we're actually going to totally different direction, and narrative seems to be the way. So it feels like we've been in this step of narrative and decoration for quite a while. I mean, Playrix's games like the Fishdom, and after that, the Homescapes came in 2016. So I think we're close to some kind of disruption.
Yeah, maybe, but I'm thinking that it might be a lot about like survivorship bias. Because, I mean, one of the games that existed on the King platform when I started was a game called Puzzle Saga, which had all these aspects of RPG, and you level up your character and you explore worlds. A fairly advanced one. But my point here is that there has kind of always been these offshoots where you try to combine another metagame or another aspect to the core mechanic. And I'm not sure with Magic Dimension that it's like a crazy road up the chart, but it's not really adding that much in terms of mechanics. Maybe it's more solidifying the point you're trying to make, that builders and narrative seems to be a big thing. But then again, you have a lot of companies that haven't led to that pivotal change that you're talking about.
Yeah. So let's talk about something more easier. You mentioned the different KPIs you were using, like the DAU to MAU ratio back in the days. What other KPIs that you're looking now versus what you were looking back then? What has become more important? Probably on the marketability side, a lot of KPIs like the CTRs and the CPIs.
Well, I mean, back in the performance marketing days of AdWords, that was already. But to me, I think a lot of the silly ones, they have dropped out of circulation to a degree. But other than that, it's more like refining the existing KPIs. So instead of looking at, let's say, average time spent across daily active users, we tend to look at time spent in the first session, seeing that that is correlated to retention and stuff that actually gives us better signals, essentially. Then, of course, other engagement metrics are always good to keep an eye on. What I'm seeing more and more happen right now is that we're detailing, let's say, we segment the user base based on some activity metric, then we're looking more at those movements between the segments. That can be very enlightening.
What about the demographics? Traditionally puzzle games have been seen as female first games, and especially towards the little bit of a matured female audience. Is that still the case, or are we looking more at a wider range of demographics?
I would say that a lot of the targeting is still on the marketing side, done on US women around 35.
Not 35 yet.
I think it's that immaturity again. If you better understand your user group, then gender, is that really the main differentiator? Or is it more that, you as a player like to collaborate and compete versus those who don't? I think demographics-wise, segmentation is at least much more interesting when looking at behavioral metrics.
So looking at behavioral metrics, what are some behavioral differences that you've noticed?
Again, if we go back to motivational psychology, we can definitely see how features that promote competition or collaboration is well liked among part of the user base, whereas others actually dislike those kind of features. So it all leads up to better personalization, I feel, where we can have the games themselves guide the players into areas that fulfill their needs to a high degree.
I have to ask one thing that is traditionally one of the typical things for puzzle game players and casino game players, and that is that they play multiple of the same style of games. Like with slots games, the players might play 4 to 5 slots games at the same time. And that has been traditionally kind of the same thing with puzzle games, is that once you run out of lives, you just open up the next game. Is that still the same thing what you can see in behavioral metrics?
In terms of actual metrics, I think social play is one of the clearest. Either you like competing or collaborating, or you don't.
I play puzzle games as well, and it's basically like when you hit a stride, when you start crushing those levels one by one, and you feel that now you're getting into your groove and you're beating them, and at some point you kind of hit the wall, and then you switch, and then you start playing another one, and then you go back to the previous one, and because of the dynamic tuning, it's actually become a little bit easier once you get back into it, so you get again on that stride. So I feel like there might be a little bit to that.
Yeah, to some degree. Of course, it holds for those super engaged players that just finish their lives, and that segment exists. But I think a much bigger segment is those that have one focus game, and then you switch focus game. So in a given week, you will see maybe a couple of switches or something among the user base. Of course, we can only understand that from our portfolio, so it's that big unknown out there. But it definitely feels like that to me, that there is a focus game for the demographic. Shifting from that focus game is what you then see.
Yeah. And at the same time, a lot of these games, you get more lives by watching videos, and the session has prolonged quite significantly from the early days. It's not cut to 5 lives only and that's it, and a lot of times you get the infinite lives and stuff like that. So that's more just there for whatever, the lives thing. But let's jump into the controversial thing, is how do you stay ahead of the competition? The Tactile is way smaller than King and Playrix and Peak, and when we look at the category as a whole, I mean, it is over 3 billion yearly. How do you kind of carve your sector, your segment, your niche out of that?
Well, partly, I think as soon as you kind of hit that hyper growth, then things stall a bit, don't they, in terms of production pace and stuff like that. That's obviously something that is working out well for us. But to be more concrete, I would say that the two most important things to me to stay ahead of the curve is to be systematic and to think of the player first. It sounds very silly and simple, but if you keep working with that build, measure, learn process and record your findings, things that worked out as you expected and things that didn't, then you're already, running your knowledge generation processes and successfully. And that helps a lot, because the biggest challenge isn't maybe the next big idea or the next big meta game, that you can execute on the knowledge that you already gathered and understanding your customer base. What do they crave? What do they find? What do they appreciate? And then that in itself leads to going for these well thought through holistic designs rather than focusing on quick wins.
I wanted to ask, it's good that you haven't read the prediction post that we wrote on puzzle games, but in that one, we kind of tried to analyze the 3 ways to get into this highly competitive market. And I'm very curious to hear your opinion, because this is just an opinion. And what's your opinion on this opinion? So essentially, we found out based on the current market and the history of it, not the future, but just what's been going on in this one. And that's kind of the sense of number 1 would be the sort of a Playrix model, where the success in the category is driven by the metagame and the gameplay innovations that then result in that higher LTV. And you support that with the portfolio effect, where you launch similar type of games where, it's a brand. So the same character is now doing a home when he was doing a garden and so forth, as well as with the Fishdom is kind of, opens up the same type of game. So that's number 1. The number 2 that we kind of identified was what you guys are sort of doing, if I understood correctly, and that is sort of a Peak Games model, where even though Peak is quite substantial in terms of their revenues, they actually have very small and very nimble teams, around 15 developers, so for their multi-$100-million games. And that essentially speaks on what you were speaking, is that compact size allows you to focus and allows you to be very effective, allows your team to be very lean, allows you to do the right things. And also, you don't need that much production capabilities. You can just work hard and then do whatever needed, what's on the whiteboard and so forth. And also, also what they have is in their strategy. I mean, they essentially have only tile blasters. And that kind of speaks of the focus as well, is that they're focusing on the one type of mechanic where they're really learning how to perfect that mechanic, and as well as how to serve that mechanic to their players. So they're understanding how their players play it by not changing the mechanic. And the third thing that we kind of looked at was matching dimension. And that is sort of an innovation on the marketing side. So really looking at different ways to engage with the users. And of course, that lowers your CPI, and then suddenly you're able to acquire those much needed users in a very competitive category. So those were the kind of three things. And what do you think about that?
It does make sense. All of it, actually. I mean, the first one, that's what I would categorize as, at least to some degree, these recombinant ideas. And I would say that it's getting a foothold, though. And all of these approaches then rely on at least having sizable budget. So you wouldn't need some VC money or loans or something to actually get that foothold. Whereas I think if you think of the combination of ideas a little bit more than finding something, at least it would take something very new and transformative to make a considerable impact on the market. And that's very hard to bet on.
Exactly. And that's why I was kind of thinking that there hasn't been any major new in a few years. It's kind of been the same. So that's why I was expecting that something new is bound to happen when you look at the history of it. And the only new thing that we saw last year was matching dimension, like truly new thing that was making waves, and kind of seemed that the innovation had shifted from gameplay, from optimization, from franchise building to marketability.
To a high degree, I agree. Yeah, exactly. And we should also consider that we haven't really seen that much changes in terms of the platforms we use either. So that allowed for an ecology of interesting stuff to breed.
So do you want to finish it off with just a simple psychology question?
Those can be the worst.
No simple psychology questions. This is something new. So we do look at different gamer models and gamer aspirations, but what are the sort of psychological theories or approaches that are popular in game design, and which ones are you currently using when designing your puzzle games, as well as why is understanding of these motivations important for game design?
So I'll start with the first part there. Mentioned a few already, but Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, that's always in vogue among game designers because it's very easy to approach, I think. And it does have empirical support. Maybe not every player is prone to get into this state, and often it's applied like in a mechanical fashion where skill and challenge are too tightly coupled. Randomness can add to the fun because we as humans, we're not linear. But by definition, it's short term. So that's why I'm looking mostly at self-determination theory and started to look a little bit at theory of planned behavior as well. But the self-determination theory has provided a pretty good framework for understanding games from that psychological needs perspective. And I mentioned earlier also that, puzzle games, they satisfy the need for competence, often brilliantly. But that also means that there is probably an opportunity in designing autonomy supportive features and also providing some sort of avenue for meaningful interaction that's not just leaderboards. So in that way, it can help you in your design work. But to me, it also naturally shifts your perspective. So again, I mentioned the immature industry. One of the biggest signs of an immature industry to me is the word whales that is getting thrown around here and there. And, focusing on your most valuable customers may seem like semantics, but that does shift your perspective. And all of a sudden, you're more interested in understanding what your customer base actually wants instead of, let's say, exploiting whales. So I think the biggest thing to me is that it shifts perspective.
Yeah, I can't comment on that. I don't know too much about the psychology of puzzle games, and I'm still too much in the previous whale hunting.
I just admired in whale hunting.
Yeah? Whale hunting. Yeah, we work mainly on mid-core games, and it is pretty much a whale hunt. So
yeah, but you can see my point that even the word will block you from maybe a more positive way of thinking.
Of course, and that's something that has been happening, of course, where even mid-core games have become more accessible, and the audiences have grown, and so forth. And it makes you think that these mental models, you kind of have to get out of your shell and then look other way sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's nothing wrong with valuable customers. That's any business aspiration to a high degree. Then you're also framing them as people out there playing games and try and go for that understanding of why does this matter to you? I mean, free-to-play games already is a hard industry because any puzzle game will have players saying, why do you keep making the level so hard for me? You're cheating. And well, you don't have any sort of difficulty adjusting mechanism. It's just randomness. But already we start at a disadvantage where it's the player against the game, whereas it's probably a better long-term situation if the player is not against the game, but use the game as a sort of leisure tool.
I think we've interrogated you enough. Enough for the lightning round.
Guys, this has been the most intellectual episode of Level Up I think we've ever had. You dropped Hegel, I think, within the first maybe 10 minutes and followed up swiftly with Kahneman. So yes, thank you very much, Christophe. And thanks everyone for tuning in. See you next episode.